Hello and welcome back to our weekly news program, The Voice of East Turkestan, established by the exiled East Turkestan government. The East Turkestan government in exile criticized China's membership in the United Nations Human Rights Council. The Prime Minister of East Turkestan government in exile asked the United States to recognize the human rights violations in East Turkestan as a genocide. China launched its 7th census in East Turkestan. The U.S. Customs confiscated leather gloves from East Turkestan suspected of using forced labor. The Australian Institute for Strategic Policy unveils a 3 kilometers long camp in East Turkestan. The Chinese Communist Party declared new Islamic Hajj measures. The U.S. Congress has proposed 9 major actions to fully confront China. At 4 p.m. on October 13th, the East Turkestan government in exile strongly opposed China's election to the United Nations Human Rights Council. It is well known that China is trying to control and influence international institutions, such as the United Nations, in order to achieve its political goals in exchange for freedom, human rights, and democracy. Originally, the United Nations Human Rights Council was established in accordance with the United Nations Charter to promote and protect human rights around the world. But China's accession to the United Nations Human Rights Council, despite brutal colonization, genocide, and Chinese occupation in East Turkestan, undermines the credibility of the United Nations and the Human Rights Council. The election of China as a member of the Human Rights Council will encourage other dictatorial and degrading regimes to continue infringing on intellectual and human rights around the world. The world needs to recognize that China's accession to the United Nations, especially the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations Human Rights Council, has allowed it to spread its corrupt and dictatorial ideology to impede the United Nations from achieving its goal of establishment. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, the United Nations was created to ensure international peace and security, to develop friendly relations between nations, to promote social development, and to improve standards of living and human rights. There is no doubt that what China is doing in East Turkestan is a genocide. Millions of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic peoples are being held in concentration camps, and women are being forcibly sterilized and enslaved in the 21st century. The Chinese Communist Party is systematically destroying the culture, language, the existence of the people of East Turkestan, and it is said that the matter is more dangerous than the massacre of millions of Jews in the German Nazi camps. Commenting on China's appointment to the United Nations Human Rights Council, Salih Khuda Yar, Prime Minister of East Turkestan government in exile, said, "China's election to the United Nations Human Rights Council is like carrying a rifle to a bandit. By voting for China, the General Assembly of the United Nations will not lead. The United Nations will only increase China's desire for the brutal colonization and genocide to continue its occupation in East Turkestan. And if evil actors, including the Chinese Communist Party, are allowed to join international organizations and institutions, the world will not maintain peace and security. Therefore, the United Nations General Assembly must abide by the Charter of Nations. Failure to do so will undermine the reputation of the United Nations, and if the UN and its member states are genuinely concerned with the human rights and international peace and security, they must formally recognize the genocide of the Uyghur and other Turkic people and take measures to stop the Nazi Communist Party actions." On Monday, on behalf of the East Turkestan government in exile, the Prime Minister of East Turkestan government in exile, Salih Khuda Yar, said that the United States should know that China's actions in East Turkestan under Chinese occupation is nothing more than episodic genocide and colonization. Salih Khuda Yar tweeted saying, "What the Chinese are doing in occupied East Turkestan is nothing but genocide and colonialism as a result of the occupation. The U.S. State of Department and White House must recognize the genocide and take strict measures to stop the crimes against humanity committed by China and its Communist Party." These statements came in response to a videotape published by the U.S. State Department about the atrocities committed by China in East Turkestan. In East Turkestan, the Chinese Communist Party has violated and continues to violate human rights against Uyghurs and other Turks, including control of the Uyghur population, forced labor, erasing culture and religion. Moreover, the U.S. state has seized confidential documents. The U.S. State of Department said on Sunday in a video on Twitter, the Chinese government's use of technology to control Uyghurs and other Muslims, dubbed Chinese telegrams in an interview with the International Consortium of Investigation journalists last year shed light on the Chinese issue. The Chinese always deny such abuses by saying that the camps provide vocational training. Those who escaped from concentration camps were subjected to forced political education, trouble maintaining food and medical treatment. And they said they were prohibited from practicing religion and speaking in their own language. Now, while China has denied their allegations, it has refused an independent investigation into East Turkestan by international organizations. This rejection confirms evidence of the atrocities committed by China against Muslims. According to an important report published by the Chinese-language Xinjiang Daily on October 14th. On October 13th, the so-called Xinjiang Autonomous Region government held the third plenary session of the 7th National Census Command Group to reschedule the work of the 7th Comprehensive Census in East Turkestan. The meeting stressed that the census will play an important role in China's recent national surveys, absorbing the state of population change and development, promoting the development of the so-called Xinjiang, and achieving long-term stability. The meeting has also defined specific approaches to the census, which included an investigation of the full use of government funds, a full investigation of every resident committee, every building and every house, and count the fixed and mobile population. Observers say that the Chinese government has long imposed a population restriction policy on Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic groups in East Turkestan, who see population growth as a threat to them, and use the results of each census as a basis for national policy making. The main purpose of the Chinese census in East Turkestan is to determine the number of survivors of the genocide that China has carried out over the past 3 years, and this data can be used to determine the future of a more sinister policy in East Turkestan. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security said in a statement on October 15th that its employees have confiscated 32 boxes of leather gloves suspected of being a forced labor product on East Coast Long Beach in Los Angeles. The U.S. Department of Customs and Protection issued 5 arrest warrants on September 14th, banning the import of Chinese products. A statement issued by the Department of Homeland Security states, the products covered in the temporary detention order were manufactured by means of forced labor in East Turkestan by the Chinese government. Also, the Chinese government has systematically violated the human rights of the Uyghur people and other Islamic countries. Mark A. Morgan, Charge Affairs to Customs and Border Protection, said that the Trump administration is taking decisive measures to combat brutal forced labor and unfair trade practices in China, and said that China produces more products from forced labor, and that workers will not be subjected to torture and threats, but also to a loss in the United States trade and economy. Last September, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the Forced Uyghur Worker Detection Act. The first law completely bans the import of all products from East Turkestan and provide only clear and convincing evidence that there is no forced labor in the supply chain before the products are allowed to be imported. The second bill calls on the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission companies to disclose details of the businesses, production, and supply chain in East Turkestan, whether the suspected products were produced by forced labor or whether the production process involved Uyghurs from East Turkestan. On the 30th of September, the U.S. Department of Labor released a list of products believed to be child production or forced labor. Among them, 17 products were added, including various Chinese-made gloves and Christmas decorations. 5 new products were added this year related to forced labor of Turkic people, including the Uyghurs. The Australian Institute for Strategic Policy has revealed a satellite image of a massive 3 km camp in East Turkestan. Nepetin Ranger, a researcher at the Center for International Networks at the Australian Institute for Strategic Policy, published a picture on the internet of a 3 km long camp set up by China in East Turkestan, and showed that its area is the same size as Disney Park, and the prisoners in the camp were arrested for so-called religious and cultural crimes. The camp was expanded by 1 kilometer in June of last year, but he didn't specify the region in which the camp is located. Earlier, in a BBC report on the camps, it was stated that the largest camp in East Turkestan was located in Dawan King near Urumqi. Australian experts estimate that the camp in Dawan King can accommodate more than 130,000 people. Researchers who prepared a report on the camps last month by the Australian Institute for Strategic Studies analyzed satellite images and located about 380 camps and observed that the camps continued to expand. Another recent report found that some 16,000 mosques in the area had been demolished or destroyed. The Joint Business Department of the Communist Party in China issued the procedures for the Hajj administration of Islamic Hajj, which stipulate that no one can organize the Hajj except the Chinese Islamic Association. The regulation will take effect on December the 1st. The Islamic Hajj administration procedures consist of 7 chapters and 42 articles, which stipulate that the Muslim pilgrimage in China must be performed in accordance with the law, and that the Chinese Islamic Association is the only organization that organizes the Hajj in Mecca. And if the Chinese Muslim citizens want to participate in Hajj, it must be approved by the government first, and the Chinese Islamic Association will be able to participate in the Hajj in an organized and planned manner, but no individual will be able to organize Hajj activities himself, and violators will be punished according to the law. The procedure of the Islamic Hajj administration also stipulate that Chinese citizens wishing to participate in the Hajj must register in advance with the local religious affairs offices, and after conducting a multi-level survey, each regional government will publish an approved list of the main conditions for applicants, including patriotism, obedience to the law, and unity in talk and action. Pilgrimages should abide by the laws and regulations of China and the countries are concerned, urging governments at all levels to strictly prohibit illegal pilgrimage activities and specifically prevent religious extremism. 8 major ministries in China cooperated in the issuance of Islamic Hajj administration measures. From them, the State Administration of Religious Affairs, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, the National Health Commission, the General Administration of Customs, the State Market Administration, and the General Administration of Aviation are all included in the list. On October 6, diplomats from 39 countries at the United Nations condemned the Chinese Communist Party's human rights violations and called on China to respect human rights, especially the religious rights and human rights of all people of East Turkestan. More and more countries and institutions are now paying close attention to the Chinese Communist Party's human rights violations in East Turkestan and calls for the closure of re-education camps, the cessation of forced labor, the demolishing of mosques, and the prohibition of forced childbearing and other forms of religious persecution. According to foreign observers, at a time when there is a strong reaction to the Uyghur cause around the world, the Chinese government is ignoring global protests, increasing its restrictions on religion and adopting its policy on the weak. A typical example of this is the fact that in the past they assigned a number to their pilgrimages, passed multiple checks, and even those who claim to be eligible after returning from Hajj are arrested and imprisoned on various pretexts. as the Chinese Communist Party caused the Chinese virus to spread around the world and caused massive damage to people's lives and property. The US government gradually became aware of the nature of China and said that China has harmed the world and must pay a heavy price. The US Congress recently released a report outlining the 9 major areas for action against the Chinese Communist Party. According to Time Network, the US House of Representatives issued a report on the Chinese Working Group, in which 15 members of 11 committees in the US House of Representatives participated in more than 60 meetings. The event concluded after a meeting with more than 130 leaders. The 141-page report is divided into 6 sections: ideologies, supply chain security, national security, technology, economy and energy, as well as competition, which summarizes and describes 82 important findings about the Chinese Communist Party and makes 430 policy recommendations. The U.S. House of Representatives report summarizes the U.S. perception of the threat to China, saying that more than 40 years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the U.S. has always hoped. The U.S. House of Representatives report summarizes the U.S. perception of the threat to China, saying that more than 40 years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China, the U.S. had always hoped that China would become a responsible member to the world. So the United States ignored everything that China was doing in terms of human rights violations, economic destructions, expansionist aggression, and even China's communist ideology. He stressed that the U.S. policy towards China has failed for more than 40 years and that the Chinese ideology has undermined the basic values of international community and threatened the security and prosperity of Americans. The report also indicates that the ideology of communism determines all the decisions and actions of China from East Turkestan to Hong Kong, from economy to the virus. It also told the Americans that the Chinese policy should start with the reality, and after the debate ended, the time has come to take action against China. And in October, in an interview with the U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo on Newsmatch, he said, "Over the past few years, China has shown all its good intentions to the world, but from a different perspective. When the Chinese Communist Party disrupts the West's work and way of life, the world will become the true core of the Chinese Communist Party. I began to realize that you can see the price the US will pay for China, and that countries around the world definitely want to be allies of the US. The Chinese virus has killed more than 1 million people around the world, and for ordinary citizens and the world's middle class, it was a huge economic loss, so that China must pay the price for the President Trump, who said a few days ago that he would lead the movement against China." Thank you for watching us, and see you next week.